He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
Spiders are legitimately amazing in real life. We just don't tend to think so because we're so much bigger than them.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
If it was about a millimeter in diameter, then that would be able to support about 100 kilograms before it snapped.
But that's more than me.
Yeah, it's more than me too.
Well, thank heavens I don't spin webs 1 millimetre in thickness, because we'd all be gone as they'd eat us, wouldn't they? Because they'd be able to catch us.
I highly suspect that's the case.
I'm Bryan Crump, and welcome to Sci Fi, Sci Fact. This is a podcast where we take science fiction's strangest ideas and explore if they actually could happen. And in every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's MacDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy. In this sticky episode, Dr. Paul Hume, MacDiarmid Institute postdoctoral fellow at Victoria University of Wellington, gets caught up on Spiderman silk, the super strong strands that Spiderman slings to swing around New York.
Here's your web cartridges.
Oh, thanks, man.
What's that for?
It's my web fluid. It's for my web shooters. Why?
Whoa! That came out of you.
Yeah. You can't do that, huh?
No?
How on earth does that even?
Anyway, we're getting sidetracked. Look.
Now, Spider-Man, let's just sum up radioactive spider bit him, and that's how he got his superpowers, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. I mean, the details change a little bit depending on what movie you watch, but originally radioactive spider.
Or what comic book you watch or you read.
Yeah, exactly. Depends how far back you want to go.
Yeah, I guess it does. The thing is, though, to some extent, spiders themselves what spiders do is remarkable. And maybe we should talk a little bit more about just what an ordinary spider can do with its silk.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Spiders are legitimately amazing in real life. We just don't tend to think so because we're so much bigger than them. If we were able to scale up their web, for example, to sort of a human scale, then Spider-Man would actually be able to do a lot of the things that you see him doing in the movies.
Really?
Yeah. So people often say that spider web is stronger than steel. That's not actually quite true, but it's close. It turns out that it's tensile strength, which means how much force you have to apply to it to break a strand per unit area. It turns out that the tensile strength of spiderweb is comparable to steel, but spiderweb is a lot lighter. So if you compare it weight for weight, then it's stronger than steel.
How much width in your average little thread of spider silk? Is 1 millimetre much thicker than what the average spider does?
Yeah. So the average, obviously it depends what kind of web and what kind of spider, but if you measure the width of a strand of spider silk, it's about 3 or 4 micrometers thick. So that's a micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter.
If you had a 1 millimetre then diameter thread of spider web, how much might it be able to hold on to? Or how strong would it be?
If it was about a millimeter in diameter and kind of, you assume it's about essentially a long cylinder, then that would be able to support about 100 kilograms before it snapped.
But that's more than me. That's more than most people.
Yeah, it's more than me too.
Well, thank heavens I don't spin webs 1 millimetre in thickness, because we'd all be gone as they'd eat us, wouldn't they? Because they'd be able to catch us.
I highly suspect that's the case.
Spoken like a true scientist. What is it about the spider? What's in the chemical makeup of the silk that makes this possible? Not that stuff, well, because we were doing a hypothesis there in terms of if it was 1 millimeter thick, but given its strength at 3 or 4 micrometers, sorry, is it micron? Is it a micron?
Yeah, that's just another word for micrometer.
Yeah, what's in the chemical makeup of the silk?
It's really, really complex, but you can kind of, the way I try to think about it to, simplify things for myself, is you can kind of think of it as a strand within a strand. What I mean by that is it's a protein. And if you zoom in to sort of the molecular level, so at the scale where you would be seeing atoms and molecules, then a protein is just a chain of amino acids. So amino acids are essentially the building blocks of life.
Yeah.
And any protein is just a chain of different amino acids. And it turns out that spider silk is actually, there's only really 3 main amino acids in it. But the way that those amino acids are sequenced programs the way that molecular scale strand folds up and makes sort of larger scale structures. So if you zoom out a bit, so you've got a close-up of the web, but you're not seeing atoms and molecules anymore. If you get to that sort of scale, then if you look at spiderweb, there are basically two kinds of regions. There's highly crystalline regions where the molecules are sort of bound together really, really tightly and almost like a crystal. And those parts are incredibly rigid, and that's what gives spiderweb a lot of its strength. And then the other parts are helices. So I just think of them as like very small springs. So they're still very, very strong, but they add like elasticity to the spiderweb. So that's how you kind of get the strength and elasticity of spiderweb as a combination of those two structural features, which are all lined up in the direction of the fiber.
Does your average spiderweb also have anything on it that's sticky, which helps us prey adhere to it?
Us prey?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm getting carried away here.
No.
Flies and things.
Yeah. So the silk itself is kind of like it's kind of like the scaffold, but the spiders dot their sort of spider glue all over the web, and that's really, really sticky, obviously. And even that is like quite amazing. You would call it a viscoelastic solid. And what that means is the faster you try to free yourself from that glue, the stronger sort of restraining force it will apply on you. So it's kind of, I don't know if you've ever done the cornflower goo experiment.
No, I haven't, but I'm already wanting to do it right now. Tell me more.
Yeah, so step 1, get a whole bunch of corn flour. Step 2, you mix it with water and make sure that it's like nice and concentrated in terms of the corn flour content. And then I think mix well is the last instruction. But the point is, that's what's called it's kind of a liquid version of the same thing. So that's called a non-Newtonian fluid. So if you you can put your hands in it and it will sort of behave like a gooey normal liquid. But if you try to hit it, it feels like you're hitting a solid just for a split second.
Wow. I've got to try this at home. I may end up at A&E though. Why can't we getting back to the thread, why can't we scat it up and make something which is just as strong, us humans?
Well, I mean, there's sort of 2 parts to that. The first part is that, spider webs are the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. So their structure is very, highly adapted. But also it's one of the reasons it's so interesting is that the molecular level details aren't completely programmed by the molecular structure. The spider actually aligns those, crystals and springs as it's spinning its web. So it's influencing the structure of its web on a molecular level as it spins it. And it has some very, very complicated organs that it uses to do that. So actually the spinning process is incredibly complex and very hard to replicate. But the other thing is that we have actually made some things that are stronger than spider silk. So, for example, Kevlar from bulletproof vests, that is even stronger than spider web. Yeah.
Now, getting back to Spider-Man, and he's got these shooters. I think they come out of his hands, and the silk shoots out and attaches itself to a building or whatever he's trying to attach himself to, and he swings from building to building at great speed. How practical is that? I mean, for a start, I was watching the cartoon just before and thinking, where's he going to store all that stuff on his hands?
Yeah, that's actually what I think is the biggest challenge to his plausibility, is how he's able to store enough webbing in his web shooters in order to enable him to, do all the spectacular things that he does without having to reload every 5 seconds. One way that I thought of getting around that problem that is probably not as cool as other ways would just be, he's in a skin-tight suit anyway, so maybe he could just have some pouches on it where he could store some extra web fluid. Maybe make himself a little bit extra muscly.
I was also wondering what he'd have to eat. Assuming the stuff comes out of his own body, what's he going to have to eat to manufacture it in the first place?
Yeah, well, that would be a big problem.
Obviously a high-protein diet.
Yeah, and probably a lot of electrolytes as well. He'd probably have to stop swinging. One way that spiders actually get around that themselves is by eating their webs and recycling it. But really? I don't know if anyone... Yeah. I'm not so sure anyone would want Spider-Man to have to stop every now and again and eat his
that would
webs.
Be a very clumsy plot device that you'd have to kind of try and avoid. But the thing, actually, the opposite happens, isn't it? In the comics, his webs dissolve.
Oh, yeah, that's actually... Maybe that's the hardest thing. That's very difficult too, because from a materials science sort of standpoint, those are quite stringent requirements, right? Like it's got to be strong, it's got to be lightweight, and then it has to dissolve after about an hour, I think. But I think there are ways that you could do it. So, for example, if he had something that was unstable to light, if you assume that he has a web that's kind of two components, and he's got one part like the crystals in real spiderweb that's adding strength and rigidity, and then it's sort of embedded in a more springy part. If you imagine that the springy part was unstable to light or oxygen or water, then it is conceivable that you could have something that would degrade over sort of that time frame.
What about us having the capability to create a thread? Now, you talked about the thread. What was it? Was it Kevlar?
Oh, Kevlar.
Kevlar in bulletproof vests. What if we were able to create a thread that is as light and as strong as a spiderweb, scaled up, say, to 1 millimetre in thickness, and therefore has the strength of, can hold 100 kilograms? If we were able to do that and we had the ability to store it, roll it up very tightly, and fire it maybe from our bodies and use it as some kind of rapid abseiling material, is that in any way, is there any material at the moment that could possibly do that?
I think Kevlar would meet those requirements. I'm just not quite sure if anyone's spun it into fibers quite in that way. One other thing that I feel like I should just mention, because it's like sensationally good, is carbon nanotube ropes. So carbon nanotubes are, if you imagine a honeycomb, so it's basically a bunch of hexagons that share common sides, and you imagine every corner of a hexagon is a carbon atom, then that's the sort of parent structure for a carbon nanotube. So if you have a plane of hexagons and you roll it back onto itself to form a tube, then that's what we would call a carbon nanotube. And those materials, their tensile strengths can be sort of 100 times that of steel. But at the moment, we don't know how to fabricate them on a large enough scale to make a web or a rope out of them.
But we're working on it?
Yeah, people are doing it. I saw a really cool paper where they, it probably doesn't sound that impressive, but they made nanotube rope that was a few centimeters long. So that, I don't know, things get impressive for me once, like, you can see them with your naked eye.
Well, 3 or 4 microns of spider silk is a miracle in its own right. I mean, in terms of the bioengineering of a spider, and now that you've told me they're actually doing a bit of molecular manipulation as they spin the silk, I'm even more impressed with your average spider.
Yeah. So I didn't know that much about spiders before I started preparing for this segment, but I found out a couple of facts that I'll share that might impress you further. So if the Darwin spider can shoot its web 25 meters.
That's almost Spiderman-like.
Yeah, but it kind of relies on the wind to carry it a lot of the way. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's quite the same. And some spiders charge their webs up by sort of rubbing it as it goes out so that it builds up a static charge that can attract prey.
Absolutely amazing. Well, after this discussion, I've got a feeling that in terms of Spider-Man fiction meeting fact, probably not, but spiders themselves kick ass.
Yeah, that would be a fair take. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci Fi Sci Fact, hosted by me, Bryan Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci Fi Sci Fact on the RNZ podcast page. RNZ's podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.